This is Hilda Lauber. I am interviewing for the Oklahoma Christian College for the Oklahoma Living Legends Library. The date is May 20th, and today we are interviewing Gaynell Gettel. We are in Enid, Oklahoma. Gaynell, I understand that you've been around Enid for quite a little while.
Yes, we came here in 1905. Wait a minute. Yes, 1905. My father was connected with the Frisco Railroad. We had lived in Kansas and in Missouri. I was born in Missouri, September 1st, 1897. My brother was born in Kansas in 1902. You need to mention those kids or not.
All right. When you left Kansas, did you come directly to Enid?
We came directly to Enid, and we rode the train, and we had never seen so many windmills as we saw en route. We counted them, and we've counted 78 between Neodesha, Kansas, and Enid, Oklahoma. After we came to Oklahoma, I had another brother and two sisters. All of us attended school in Enid. All graduated from high school, and my youngest sister graduated from Phillips University here in Enid. Are we going over? Oh, all right.
You ready?
I forget. Yes. I worked for the telephone company long enough to get my tuition to the Enid Business College. I worked for several companies before going to OG&E in 1927. At that time, Mr. Bierbauer was the manager. The telephone company had sent me to Oklahoma City to work, and then I was to go to Tulsa thereafter. But Mrs. Bierbauer and my mother, being good friends, they hatched up the plan that I should work for OG&E when Mr. Bierbauer found a place for me, which he did in 1927. I was to be his secretary. However, the girl whose place I was to take decided not to quit, so I was put into the contract department, which I didn't care for because I met the public, and it wasn't the type of work I was accustomed to doing. So I was looking around for something else when a job appeared in the engineering department. They were looking for someone, and so somebody said, well, why don't you take what you got? You got Gaynell there, and she can do what you want. So I was transferred to the engineering department and continued in that department until my retirement, September 1st, 1962. I enjoyed my work thoroughly with the OG&E. When I got into the engineering department, we had just taken over about 26 towns in northern Oklahoma that had been established. The distribution systems had been established by a company called United, and the OG&E had bought them out. And it fell to my lot to help record all their systems and put them on the maps and that sort of thing.
Gaynell, what kind of a title did you have with OG&E?
Originally, I was just a clerk. Eventually, I was secretary. And in the last phase of my work there, I was called an engineer's aide. One, I think, of the few, if maybe only the one, engineer's aide who was a woman. And through the years, I learned the engineering business to such an extent that I carried the load of a man, really. However, I didn't always receive the pay of a man because girls didn't get that kind of pay.
Working for utilities, I imagine that you were pretty busy during a storm. I know Enid has had their share of storms up here. Can you relate any interesting experiences?
Yes, we've had a number of storms that were pretty bad. Well, one time we were plagued by ice. The wind would blow the conductors together, and then they would burn down, and we'd have to repair them. Any person who works for OG&E is always aware of continuity of service, so everybody is on the job at a time like that. Our first duty is to get service restored. We had lines feeding from the south, lines feeding in from the east, and we thought surely it would carry the town. But first one line would go out and get it repaired, and maybe before it was thorough or completely repaired, the other one would go out. We had the north and south line. We felt since the storm was coming from the north that it wouldn't bother the north-south line. It wouldn't be across it. But we had 1 mile in that line, which was east and west, and it went out. And Enid was without service for 2 hours and 43 minutes. I was the only woman in the operating department for quite a few years. And our headquarters were at what we call the gas house. It had been a gas manufacturing plant at one time, but it had been converted to offices. So we always referred to it as the gas house. So, being the only gal out there, I was called Gas House Gertie by a lot of them, you know. But Gas House Gertie was on the emergency list, same as anybody else. So when an emergency arose, I was called the same as the men were, because I did much of the work inside, the telephoning and assembling crews sometimes, and dispatching outside crews that came in that didn't know where to go to help. And one storm I remember, I appeared at 6 each morning and helped dispatch the crews. Crews came in from Oklahoma City and I think even as far south as Ardmore. They didn't know which way to go to get to Hunter or Helena or something, so I would help dispatch them, keep track of the number of men on the crew, and so that we keep track of their time. Then at 8 o'clock, I went to the engineering department, and there we worked all day trying to assemble what had happened the day before and make sketches and material lists for new breaks in places where poles were out. Then in the evening, I'd run these sketches on the OSLED machine so that they could be sent to the storeroom for the material to be assembled along with the sketch. And I'd work for about 4 days. I worked from 6 to 10. When I got my salary check, I thought they'd made a mistake. Got so much money. One thing I did at the OG&E, I guess I'd been here about a month when the manager, Mr. Bierbauer, asked me if I would write their news. Well, I was obligated to him, of course. I had my job through him, so I said yes, I would. Then our paper was called Sparks and Flashes. It was a mimeograph sheet for distribution around in Enid and the division. Eventually, it was included in the Meter, which is the overall company paper. I continued to write the news from Enid until my retirement in 1962. I guess I have the questionable title of being the one that would hang on the longest in such a tough job. But I enjoyed the work, and I remember they gave me a traveling case when I had written 25 years, I believe it was. But I thoroughly enjoyed the work. It wasn't anything that I would complain about.
How long did you work for OG&E?
35 years and 5 months, I believe it was, that I worked for OG&E.
What was the date of your retirement, do you remember?
September 1st, 1962. At the end, 35 years and 5 months is what it was, I believe. Let me see.
Since your retirement, have you taken many vacations, or are you one of these people that plan trips all through your life?
Well, I've traveled rather extensively while I worked, and since I've retired, that's one of my ambitions, to travel, and I've done quite a little of it. We go to the East Coast quite often, and I go about twice a year to see my brother in Flagstaff and my sister in Palm Springs, and we hope to go to the coast this year. And while I worked, we went to Pacific Northwest. We went to Canada. During the war, we were up in Montreal and Quebec. I can remember seeing all kinds of service people in Canada, even to some Aussies, you know, with the hat turned up the side. And in Montreal, there was an MP, and it was a woman, and she was about 6'2", and she was built with it, and she was directing everybody at the station. It was the first time I ever saw a woman MP. All right. 2 different years, we went to Europe. The first time we went by boat, my sister and I, with 4 friends, and did one section, and then in 1957, 5 years later, my sister and I went, just the 2 of us. 6 people is too many. And we went, the second time, we took in other countries. We loved Europe, and I should like to go back to the Scandinavian countries, but I'm not sure I'm going to get there.
Well, Gaynell, you have mentioned your brothers and sisters and some of the enjoyable times you've had with them. Are either of your parents still living?
My father died 25 years ago, and my mother is still living. She is 90, and she's bright and alert. She had her 90th birthday, August 20th. And friends came by to congratulate her, and I said, well, I'm sorry about that, but she has gone to garden club. Rather funny thing about Mama, she fainted, and we're frightened to death because of her age that she may fall and hurt herself. We thought maybe she had a stroke, and we rushed her to the hospital. The boys came out in the ambulance, and it's kind of an old rambly thing, Shackley or whatever. And on the way down here, we thought she'd fainted or something. She said, you boys have either got a flat tire or something. This thing doesn't ride very well. And they thought the old lady was out of her mind, but she really wasn't.
All right, let's back up a little bit. We talked about your education, your first coming to Enid. We did not mention at all the religious aspect of your life. What denomination do you belong to?
I belong to the Episcopal denomination now. However, originally, when I was about 3, our grandmother, my father's mother, came to live with us. She was a staunch Methodist. In fact, my father's name was John Wesley. She had a second son whose name was Edward Finley, and I think he too was a good Methodist. I'm not sure about that. But grandmother saw that we went to church, and they tell that I was not potty broken when she took me to church the first time, and that was in Kansas. And I can remember so well when I was in Sunday school in Kansas, they're singing Bringing in the Sheaves, and I always thought they meant bringing in the sheets, and I have wondered and wondered why. But grandmother was a very faithful Methodist, and when we came to Enid, we went to the Methodist church, and she saw that we were taken to revival meetings and all, and I went down one time, and I was baptized on July 29th, 1906. I wasn't sure what it was all about, but the other kids went down, so I did too. And that was the way I became a Methodist. Our mother had gone to the Episcopal Church when she was a girl. And when we got to Kansas, there was no Episcopal Church there, but there was one when we came to Enid. So Mother went there from time to time, and finally all of us went over there. And I think I must have been, it must have been about 1912, when some kids I knew belonged to Episcopal Church and took me over there. So after that, I went all the time. About broke my grandmother's heart, but we finally went into the church. And they needed somebody to teach Sunday school, so I started teaching Sunday school about 1915. Golly, about 55 years ago. I wasn't even confirmed yet. I think it was confirmed in 1918. But like the media correspondent bit, I stayed with it, and so I think I've taught around, well, give me 50 years, because the last 2 or 3 years I haven't taught. But I'm going into the history of the Sunday school a bit, and I find out that it was the first organization in St. Matthew's Church. It was established in 1895 or 6. There are 2 different records of it, and they disagree. But apparently it was the first organization, and it had 15 children in it. It has, I should judge, well, I'm afraid to say how many there are now. I really don't know, because I haven't checked lately. But in about 1909, a Mrs. Southard came to Enid, one of God's gentle women, and she herded the Sunday school for years and years, and she died in about 1942. By then, I was working at it pretty faithfully, and so I sort of inherited her job as superintendent and secretary and all that sort of thing. But in the early days, there was only just the church. We had nothing but the pews for our classrooms, and we would space them 2 or 3 pews apart, and there'd be a big buzz during Sunday school when all the classes were meeting. First, we didn't have money enough for good material, but eventually we did, and we did the best with what we could. And we feel that St. Matthew's Church School has been a success. There are lots of funny things that we could tell you about it, but as a whole, we think it's been a success. One of the things that this church school always did was have a pageant at Christmas time. And the little boys would be shepherds, little girls would be angels, and then the 5th and 6th graders would take the parts of Mary and Joseph and all the others that were needed. The little ones were costumed, the boys especially, were costumed in burlap bags turned inside out to look, to resemble skins, or rough clothing. And when the children were dressed for the pageant, everybody who helped were warned to turn the sack inside out. One time, one got through, and as he walked into the spotlight, here it said on his back, Idaho potatoes. Some of the 6th grade boys would always be wise men and bring the gifts, of course. And they were never wise men to each other. They were wise guys. And one year, some fellow thought we ought to have crooks for the little shepherds, and so we did. And when the wise guys got up to present the gifts, the little shepherds tried to hook the wise guys and trip them. So we only used those crooks one year. And one year, we had 3 wise men, and on the day of rehearsal, one did not appear. So hurriedly, we got another boy to take the place, and at that night, we had 3 wise men and 3 gifts. The last minute, a 4th boy, the original boy, came, and fortunately he was vested or costumed, and he came. And what do you do with 4 wise men? Well, we got him a gift, and he went down. And we were all ready because the Bible doesn't say there were 3 wise men. There were 3 gifts. Wise men came, but it never says how many. So that was that. Another time, the angel Gabriel announced to the shepherd that there was the coming of the infant Jesus, and he had on a brand new wristwatch, and it glistened in the light. And then another time, the little girl who was to be the Virgin Mary, a dear child, we said, you are to be the Virgin Mary this year. And she said, goody, goody, I've always wanted to be a virgin. Another traditional thing at St. Matthew's Church has been the Easter egg hunt. At first, it was held at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Fred Miller. Then it was taken to the lawn of the church. The children have a great deal of fun and enjoy this Easter egg hunt very much. One year, one of the children found an egg that they failed to find the year before, and we knew it was a year old from the odor. Another time, we always asked the congregation to bring us boiled eggs, and then the older children have the fun of having a dyeing party. And then they also help hide the eggs for the children. Somebody failed to dye their eggs, and you can imagine what a mess that was. Afterward, when the church was extended and absorbed the yard, we went to the home of Mr. and Mrs. Joe Mybergen, about 5 miles north of town. They lived on a big acreage, and we had a lot of fun out there. But the thing has been very fine because the children of all ages were able to participate, the older ones to help the little ones, and the little ones to have some help they needed.
Apparently, you felt that along with Sunday school, your youngsters should have some kind of social opportunities, that the church should provide this. Can you think of any other social activities?
Well, on occasion, we would have Halloween parties, and the children loved them. Sometimes they'd get horribly frightened, the little ones, but we could talk them out of that. But I've always felt that they needed the social contact with the others in their classes as we went along. We had Christmas parties some of the time, but we felt that they should give rather than receive. And when we had these pageants, we would bring white gifts, and they were taken to the state school for the retarded children, And on more than one occasion, we would see a child take his white gift down. It was supposed to be a brand new toy. He'd take it down and set it down and stand there and look at it, and then Mom would have to come and get him and take him back to his seat because he wouldn't leave it.
It sounds like your youth program during the early days of the church consisted of all ages. I suppose as time went by, you did have your junior high groups, your high school groups. Do you want to comment on that?
I would like to comment to this extent that so many times, it may be true in other churches as well as St. Matthew's, we'd groom them for their confirmation. And they would think then they knew all and they were too smart to come to church school. The consequence was always hard to have a high school class, and our youth groups have been sort of hit and miss, sometimes pretty strong, and sometimes we've had all of them together, and sometimes we've divided by junior high and high school, sort of depending on our supply of youth, really.
Being a Sunday school teacher for 50 years, you have certainly seen several generations of youngsters go through the church. Is there anyone in particular that you feel has made a good contribution to our Christian society?
A number of the boys and girls who've gone through the church school have gone out into very good positions. I can't remember any of them ever becoming politicians, however, but I do know that some of them have become church school teachers, and yes, one has become a priest. I remember now. Vern Jones out at Woodward was in our church school, and I'd kind of forgotten Vern as having been there. But I do feel that all of them have received something from the church. There's one thing I've noticed throughout the years. Some of the boys and girls who are erratic in their attendance now have children who are erratic in their attendance.
Over the 50-year period, did you notice a great deal of difference in the teaching of the Episcopal religion in Sunday school?
Yes, I've noticed a great deal. In the early day, we didn't have very good material. I don't know whether it was because the church didn't buy it or not. We sort of worked on what we could find and improvised quite a little. And then we got the Episcopal Church's teaching series. Then, as you may remember, we revised our teaching series. The other had gotten so old, they thought. They revised it. Well, they revised it so far out that a lot of the teachers didn't like it. It had to do with their imagination, and some of them didn't have it. They didn't have the leadership, and consequently, it didn't prove exactly what the church had hoped it would. It has since been revised, and more nearly, I think, is what they intended it to be. But it was something of a failure at first, we felt.
I don't know too many people who have had a day named after them, and I know that there is a Gaynell Gettel Day. It was celebrated some time ago. Would you like to comment? Tell us something about that.
Well, I've always said, I've taught Sunday school 100 years, and somebody took me up at it and got to figuring out and figured that I had about that. Only was about 45, I think, then. But they got the notion that they would honor me one day, and it was a surprise, and the rector made a proclamation that this was Gaynell Gettel Day, and I was called up front, and he gave me the proclamation, and he also gave me silver dollars representing one for each year I'd taught, and when I counted them, there were 45. And friends, those silver dollars are valuable now. They don't make them, and you can't get one even at a bank.
I know that your heart was really in the Sunday school at St. Matthew's, but I'm sure you did some other work, and you have some other stories about the St. Matthew's Church, the building, some of the rectors that have served there.
Of St. Matthew's, one has never been written, and the history of St. Matthew's starts with the town of Enid. Bishop Brooke, who had been a bishop only about 6 months, came into what later became North Enid, but where the railroad stopped, from Kansas. He came in on Saturday, which was the day of the run. He slept on a load of lumber in a boxcar. The next morning, he went over to the railroad water tank and washed up and walked down to what became Enid. There was a fight between the government and the railroad. The government wanted Enid to be where it is presently. The railroad wanted it North Enid because they had a depot there and a watering place and felt it was the logical thing. The government thought they were trying to make money off the land. Enid became the town site eventually, but the railroad would not stop at the south location. Consequently, anybody who wanted to board a passenger train would have to go to the north town, have to get a hack or get up there some way. And merchants in Enid who wanted their merchandise would have to drive clear to North Enid to get it because the railroad wouldn't stop. The citizens in Enid decided to do something about it, and they sawed the bridge and wrecked the train, and thereafter the Rock Island would stop at Enid. They felt they must. That was in the early day. Well, Bishop Brooke came to Enid then on the 17th, which was Sunday, and held a service from the back of a buckboard on what is now the public square in Enid. The people in Enid, some of them were Flybanites, some were people who were good, solid citizens, but anyway, the citizenry changed from time to time in the early day. Money was very scarce. There were crop failures, and in 1899 and 1900, Enid could not pay its assessment to the state church of $1.25. That would have been 5 cents apiece, but they could not raise it. The bishop came regularly. We have a letter from an early priest. He was not a priest at the time he was here, but he served Enid, and he tells about their coming to Enid and to North Enid. North Enid was known as St. Thomas Church, and Enid was known as St. Matthew's. The bishop hoped to have church started, so he kept hoping they would buy some property. Well, in 1900, he had a committee formed, and in 1901, they bought, the woman who was at the head of the committee bought 6 lots, the present 2, which is 13 and 14 in Block 48 of Kenwood Edition, and 4 to the east. She paid $250 for the 6 lots. She sold the 2 on the end at the corner for the church to the church for $126.50. 4 months later, she sold the other 4 for $100 apiece. So she did all right on her investment, which she could have done otherwise, because the story is told of a man who had a lot down in the flats, which was an area south and east of the public square in Enid, where the water stood. And he didn't want it because the water stood down there, but he had a dead horse that he had to have taken away. And so he gave this man that carried the horse off, that hauled it off, the title to the lot down in the flats. That's one of the very fine commercial areas now. We didn't have a resident priest until 1905 because there was no place for him to live. A rectory was built in 1905, and according to the records, it was paid for. It was $1,500 and paid for all but $525. The original church was a frame building and was replaced in 1909. Why they would replace it so soon, I'm not sure, but it was sold to a colored Baptist church that moved it to 4th and Market. But during the building of the church, the congregation met in the Church of the Seventh-day Adventists, which I thought was rather interesting. The Parish House was not added until 1923, when a Mrs. Zelia left a legacy of $1,500 for this parish house. She was one of God's saints. She had worked faithfully, diligently for the Enid charities, and she kept right behind the authorities getting work done. She didn't have a great deal, but she left $1,500, excuse me, $1,500 to the church, and she left $100 each to the then rector and the one just before him at the time she died. And I'd always hoped that the building could be named for her, but everybody thought Pay Hall wouldn't do, so it has never been named for her. The church, the Parish House, was an atrocity. It was white stucco and was thrown together, and you could see the ground through the floor in some of the spots. It was replaced in 1955 when the church was extended to the north, the Parish House demolished, and a new one installed connecting up to the church, which makes a lovely building now. Rather interesting is the fact that St. Matthew's church building has overhead bracings. No doubt this was done in 1909 for protection against tornadoes. There were two other churches with this type of construction, the Christian on the corner of the Boulevard and Adams, and the Presbyterian on the corner of Boulevard and Randolph, which were constructed in this fashion, and both have been demolished. When the church was extended in 1955, the architect was at a loss as to how to extend the church and retain this same type of overhead bracing. He studied it and came up with the answer, and when it was all over, he said, "I've learned to love this type of architecture." He has since left Enid, but it's rather interesting that this bracing is what held the church together in 1968 when it was discovered that the foundation of the west wall was inadequate and would have to be removed. The entire wall was removed. The bracing held it all together during the removal and reconstruction.
Do you recall who the original contractor was?
The original contractor of the frame building in 1902 was a Bass Construction Company. HB, I believe, was his initial. He was a contractor around Enid for many years, built lots of churches, many schools in the area. In fact, some of his family are still in Enid. You may know Henry B., who is quite a historian and puts out a very interesting letter frequently. I don't know.
Gaynell, I know that you worked in the church a lot. I'm sure that you were on the Alder Guild.
Yes, indeed. I've been on the Alder Guild. In fact, at present, I'm assistant of the bookshop and on the memorial committee, but I worked for many years on the Alder Guild. And at that time, we had what was known as a dossel, a colored hanging that hung behind the altar, and with the changing of the seasons, we changed the colors. And anybody on the Alder Guild knew what a chore that was. I used to do quite a little work with Mrs. Mabley, Clara. She was the rector's wife. She was a Sunday school teacher and Alder Guild worker and everything. But anyway, we did our Alder Guild work together. We also played tennis together. In order to see who would polish the brass rail, alms basins, and the candle holders, we'd play a set of tennis, and whoever lost had to do the polishing. She claims I did it all the time. I claim she did it all the time, so I don't remember how it was, really. It was back in Depression days, and we were all very poor. In fact, we couldn't even pay the rector's salary on top of a bank failure. We were really poor, and he finally had to leave here to go to Kansas to get a parish where he could get money to pay his grocery bill, actually. And until recently, I didn't know that he was helping 8 or 10 people at that same time who didn't have anything either. After he got to Kansas, he was pretty poor, you know, as we were. He didn't have a white stove. So I got a hurry-up call one day. He wrote me a letter and said, "Gaynell, send me that white stove right quick, because I'll need it for Sunday." So I mailed it up to him. He used it on Sunday and sent it back. No one knew the difference. No one ever wiser.
That's a delightful story. I know we could go on and on talking about the church, but I do want to find out a little more about Enid in its early days. When you first arrived here, you were a child, but can you remember if the streets were paved, what kind of transportation there were, perhaps the type of clothing people wore?
I remember that the streets around the square were not paved, and when it was bad weather and rainy, they were just like a loblolly. All the stores had a porch out in front, and most of them had a raised platform, and you had a wooden sidewalk. I guess would be the equivalent of a sidewalk. And I remember a racket store. We'd call it 5 and 10 cent store on the northwest corner. And I used to love to go in there and see the various things that could be bought for a nickel in those days. Then there was, as for the clothing, everyone wore long dresses, as I remembered. I don't remember too much about the men's clothing, but I remember that the women wore long dresses. There was an undertaking establishment just west of the square that was a thing that made Enid famous in its day, because it had in it a body of a man who had committed suicide in Enid and claimed to be the man who shot Lincoln. And this became rather a famous body and was sold to a carnival and later to a circus and all. And the story went that anybody who owned the body of this suicide victim always had bad luck.
How was the body preserved?
I don't know how it was preserved, but when I saw it, some kids and I had run away from school, and I knew that my mother didn't know where I was, and I wasn't sure she would like my going in to see this dead man. So I went with the kids, and the body was supported in a box, standing upright, and was slightly discolored. I suppose the man kept embalming it. He had it for years. But I can remember going home and telling my mother about it, and my mother said, "Don't ever do that again."
Gaynell, I know we can't expect to review your life history in 45 minutes. This has been very interesting, and perhaps we can get together again sometime and finish your reminiscence.
Thank you very much, and I'd be glad to do anything else I can for you.
Oh.
All right.